One genre of television show or movies that I really enjoy watching are survivalist shows. Now, I'm not talking about zombie apocalypse or, some of these doomsday preppers, that kind of stuff. I'm talking about if you think about like the older movie Castaway with Tom Hanks, where somebody's set into this impossible position, right? They're abandoned, they're in a hopeless situation, stranded on an island out in the wilderness of the Canadian Rockies or something like that, where death is certain. And the story is about how they survive, what they do to endure everything that they're given, everything that's placed in front of them to somehow survive, to fend off death. In all these stories, there's always one thought that they can cling to, one thing that they pin their hope on that they will survive. Usually it's like a family member being reunited with them, or a loved one, or just to see their kids again. But there's this one thought that brings them through and lets them endure all of these troubling things. And I think that's a great example of what hope is, right? It's this one thing that helps us to defy all the odds and allow us to endure things that a normal human normally wouldn't, and to survive these things and to avoid death. Now, on the other hand, you look on the first reading, and we hear about these 7 sons that were being tortured, and they had hope as well, but they weren't hoping to avoid death. They essentially embraced death. If you think about the story that was going on there, obviously they were Jewish, and under the Jewish law, you weren't allowed to eat pork. That was one of the forbidden foods that you couldn't eat. Now remember, we have a pancake porky breakfast today, and we're Christians, and Jesus made all food clean, so don't worry about eating porkies, right, Phil? They're good. But anyhow, under their law, they could not eat pork. And the king was trying to test them to try to, bring them from their faith. And said, well, just eat some bacon or eat this or eat that. And they're like, we would rather die. We will gladly die instead of eat pork. And the reason they did that is they had hope, and they said they have hope in the resurrection. So they had hope in something beyond this life. They knew that God created them in his image and likeness, and God is eternal. And therefore, they knew that, there's something beyond this life. There's something that God has in store for us even after we die. And our hope is that when we live our lives to the faith that he's given us, that he'll keep his promise and that we will have a resurrection. So that hope let them endure certain death and torture and everything just to maintain that faith. Now we move into the gospel and we hear about these Sadducees. Right on the very first line it says they deny the resurrection. So who are the Sadducees? The Sadducees were like the rich and powerful, politically connected people of the time of Jesus. They were essentially like the high priests. They were the Sanhedrin. They were the ones that ran the temple markets, those things that Jesus came in with the whips and turned over the tables. They were corrupt, and they were power hungry, and everything that they did was determined to kind of keep their life the way it was. And why did they behave like that? Well, because they didn't believe in the resurrection. What they believed is that after you died, that was it, right? There is no afterlife. There is no eternal spirit. So if you have that mindset, how do you conduct yourselves? You have no consequence of how you conduct yourself, so the reward of life is life. So naturally, people will turn to corruption and those sorts of things, power, in order to make their life as comfortable as possible, because they had no hope in the resurrection. All they had hope in was having the best life that they thought at that point in time. So their hopes were kind of pinned on the wrong thing. They didn't have any hope of resurrection. They didn't believe in that, so they thought, well, let's just do what we got to do to make our lives the best. And this is why when Jesus came in, and he obviously believes in the resurrection, they didn't like that, because he was challenging their entire way of life and saying, you know what, you have to live differently. You have to live to serve other people. And that's only because you believe that there's something coming after. Now, in the absence of hope, what do we call that? That's despair, right? So, I've talked many times about despair and how we're living in times of despair. where people don't know hope, don't have hope, don't know who hope is. They have nothing either to help them endure the troubles that they have now, or realizing that, in the life after, if we have faith, we have hope that everything will be rewarded and will be good, and we'll be happy, and we'll be joyful. If you don't know that, it's easy to fall into despair, and then we know the results of all that. So I guess we come up to the basic question. It all boils down to, kind of what do you think? I mean, there's truth. We know that there is life after death, but do we internalize that? Do we say, you know what, the way I live my life, is it the end when I die? You talk about the atheists, it's like, well, when we die, that's it, we're done. Well, then kind of the argument is, well, what if you're wrong? We believe there's an afterlife. If you're wrong, the eternity is going to be not very pleasant for you. But we know that there is afterlife, and we know that there's hope in the afterlife because Jesus gave us that hope. Jesus came down, he was born a human. He lived a human life as God as well, fully divine, fully human, to experience everything we did as sin. And he did that to conquer the one thing that traps us all, and that's death. The only thing that gets in the way of true hope, really, the one thing that's a stumbling block for hope. If you remember back in creation, Adam and Eve were created, and death wasn't in the world at all. That wasn't God's plan. God didn't want death, and he didn't want misery. He didn't want all this stuff. So when original sin came in and death entered the world, God had a plan. He said, this isn't what I want for you. Eventually, I'm going to have somebody to come. I'm going to send my only son. I'm going to send myself down, and he's going to conquer death. And how did he do that? He died on the cross, right? So he gave himself up willingly. He died there. He kind of lured death in to say, take me. And then when death took him, 3 days later, he rose. So he conquered death. If Jesus just died and that was the end of the story, we say, oh, okay, he was a great man. He spoke all these things, but he died on a cross just like the thousands of others did. In reality, we'd all be wasting our time right here, right now. Without the resurrection, without Jesus conquering death, there would really be no reason for us to be here, because there's a lot of great people that we can hear about. But we pin our hope on the fact that Jesus conquered death. We pin our hope on the fact that as Christians, we are baptized into his resurrection. We're baptized into his death, and we're also baptized into his resurrection. So we know through that sacrament, we know what awaits us. We know the resurrection awaits us. So that gives us great hope to endure the things that we endure in our life. But it also gives us hope in the fact that we can be thankful for the gifts that God gave us. There's many things that happen that are great in our lives, many joyful things. That hope is from God too. It's not us doing it, it's God giving us these gifts. So he gives us hope in life, and he gives us hope in death. He gives us the ability to endure the hardships, but because we know that in the future, through the resurrection, that we can be with him forever. And I think the biggest sign of the hope that we get, not only when we look on the cross and we realize that he rose from the dead, he gave us the Eucharist. So every Mass, we can encounter him and could feel his presence, and we can consume him, and when we do that, we consume hope, literally. If you read John chapter 6, he says, I am the bread of life that comes down from heaven, so that one may eat it and not die. Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life, and I will raise him on the last day. That's what we pin our hope on. We pin our hope on the promise of Christ. We know that his promises are trustworthy, and every time we receive him in the Eucharist, he strengthens us, gives us that ability, and reaffirms our hope. So I just want you to think about your survival story. What's going on? What do you pin your hope on? What are you thinking about hope? Is Christ the center of that? Because he's the only one that can deliver in life and in death.